Welcome to the Antidote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Rothkushel.
I guess I'll start out by saying Happy Labor Day to everybody out there, regardless of if you're working today or not. Really the last major day of summer, so I hope everybody gets out and enjoys it.
Yes, and it's actually pretty nice out here before it's going to get a little hotter later in the week.
Indeed. So it's kind of the last ride, I guess. So, yeah, my dog and I went out for a nice walk this morning. It was very humid. It was pretty humid. So hope everybody has a great day. And I guess we should get into it here. I would like to bring up right away. I think this will delve into a couple of the other topics we're going to discuss today. It'd be good. It's an important story. It also serves as a segue. Sirhan, the alleged RFK assassin, stabbed in prison. So this is as of this weekend, and it actually will dovetail into some information that you've just stumbled upon regarding Sirhan and RFK. And it's been out there, but it's stuff that we're that's now being brought to our attention. So yeah, it's interesting. Whitney Webb alleges that that there had been threats against Sirhan by an Israeli a fellow prisoner. So very interesting. And Jeremy, what do you know about this, and what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, the timing of this is very strange, or not that strange, or is interesting. And I've been running into little pieces surrounding the RFK assassination, because as we began to do our research into the assassinations of the 60s as really the progenitors of the false flag operations.
By the way, Jeremy, I just wanted to read this. I was going to just clarify this tweet from Whitney Webb. She says, apparently his brother said that a month ago Sirhan was being threatened by an Israeli-American prisoner, but doesn't know if the guy who stabbed him is the same guy yet. So,
right. So this threat is interesting, and then a little bit time later, an actual stabbing of what we would say is the apparent patsy of the RFK assassination. And we've dealt with aspects of the RFK assassination before, and how there's a network surrounding it there's a continuity here of agenda in many ways. And maybe we'll touch on even that aspect too in terms of our next maybe news story that we'll deal with before we deal with some more deeper analytical articles and reading, is that General Dynamics IT, who we referenced before in our show about the Gulfstream being bought by General Dynamics, and then a relationship of General Dynamics with the IAI, Israeli Aerospace Industries. I've never quite get that acronym correct, but the deep background of the actual Israeli state aerospace industry. And I was hypothesizing that there is a relationship there in terms of a macro surveillance agenda in terms of Gulfstream airplanes, which are the go-to of choice of the wealthy and the powerful around the world in terms of private airplanes. And so this then also ties into what we were talking about last week in terms of Teterboro as a key hub of the Epstein network, and then General Dynamics having just received a major Pentagon cloud contract that somehow we missed. And I feel bad about having missed this other. We've talked about the so-called JEDI, the Joint Enterprise Defense Infrastructure cloud, but General Dynamics just received a something $7-8 billion contract for another DoD cloud that seems to also be tied into Microsoft and Dell computers, and so we'll deal with that. But the reason why I bring that up is the General Dynamics, the Crown family, their relationship with the Shine family surrounds the actual location of the RFK assassination, then the Ambassador Hotel, I believe it was called, in it's a little bit west of downtown Los Angeles, and I know that area well. I lived in Koreatown there for a while, and there was a church on Wilshire, which was like one of the main places where KPFK, the radio station, would hold some of their community events. We held 9/11 Truth events at that church, which is really just a few blocks down the street on Wilshire Boulevard from what used to be the Ambassador Hotel. And I think it might have been maybe the 37th anniversary of the RFK assassination, went down there and did some just street action with a sign and talked to people and that. So and that was right before, I believe, that they were actually going to knock down the Ambassador Hotel in order to build a new spiffy, sort of STEM-oriented high school or junior high school for the LAUSD school district. So I'm familiar with that area, and it's one of the things that I think we're beginning to focus on more. That you begin to look at the architecture of these events. It's very literally looking at the architecture, meaning the buildings and who owns them and what are the interests represented. And maybe we'll return to this issue in relationship to the President John Kennedy assassination, which has to do with all of the emphasis on the school book depository building, the 6th floor, Oswald and the rifle and the window. And then the alternative is proposed as the grassy knoll, right? And all the references to that. But meanwhile, right across the street there in Dealey Plaza, from the school depository book building is the Tex building, the Dallas Textiles building. And we will link to some articles. We have been linking actually to some articles about who owned that building and some of the interests in things like Dallas Uranium and Oil, I think is one of the companies that was located in that building. And then, of course, Abraham Zapruder, the 33rd degree, secret society Mason, Scottish Rite, I think, the filmer of the hit. His company was also in the Dallas Textile, the Tex building there, that I believe holds much of the architecture of the hit against Kennedy in the mix there, highly tied to the local Anti-Defamation League, and of course this very strong component of the merger of certain big industrial specific energy interests, the very specific aspects of the military industrial complex in relationship to what we'll talk about next in terms of Johnson's relationship to the Crown family, the General Dynamics family, which of course we've talked about is also now the Aspen Institute family. And the relationship with Israel only grows tighter over the years. But then also specifically in this John Kennedy assassination context, the question of the shipping of arms and potentially the architecture of the shipping of uranium to Israel, and specifically the deep interest in the Israeli nuclear program, which now we can then tie in a very strange fashion back to the RFK assassination, in that who is the main figure that is seen as the most well-known agent for the trucking and bartering of Israeli nuclear technology. It's Arnon Milchan, right? The producer of JFK, the Oliver Stone film, which basically whitewashed the entire tie-in to Israel. The connection to Permindex is hinted at, but then that is then all tied only back into some shadowy
In the
US.
quick side point, Oliver Stone looks more and more like a very interesting person than all of this is. And as time goes on, we may delve into that. I just wanted to throw.
And I think that I was reading the biography of of Arnon Milchan titled Confidential by Meyer Daron and Joseph Gelman, The Life of Secret Agent turned Hollywood Tycoon Arnon Milchan. And it has some very interesting background of Milchan and how he came to his position and some of his connections. And I think it was in that book that it said something about how he had a house in Malibu that had originally been John Frankenheimer's house. And then I ran into another article that was talking about the RFK assassination and how RFK had spent the night before and most of the day of his assassination at John Frankenheimer's house in Malibu before being driven apparently by John Frankenheimer himself to the Ambassador Hotel for the celebration of his victory, and where he's then led into to the kitchen and apparently with a handful of different operatives running the operation there. So I just thought that was a very strange connection. And then John Frankenheimer is known for, the film The Manchurian Candidate, which, when you think about a singular event in American history, in modern American history, that you would describe as what is usually described as a potential Manchurian candidate, it would be this Sirhan the accusation of Sirhan as the killer or the assassin of Robert Kennedy. Of course, that whole story is very much a cover-up of who actually did it, who actually pulled the trigger behind Kennedy's right ear, is what it looks like, and it was not Sirhan. But that very strange linkage of the creator of the film The Manchurian Candidate being the place where Robert Kennedy spent his last night is very stunning. And then maybe what we'll do is tie in some of the background of Frankenheimer. His films were distributed by the United Artists Agency, and that's Arthur Krim. He had a wife, Matilda Krim, that we can then delve into in a little bit. But Greg.
Yeah, I wanted to read a little bit, an excerpt from an article published on icarereviews.wordpress.com, April 14th. Article's titled JFK, RFK, John Frankenheimer, and the Mystery of Sirhan. And this is an excerpt from a book called Protocols of the Elders of Zanuck, Psychological Warfare and Filth of the Movies. Anyway, I want to read a little bit from this article as it relates to John Frankenheimer and also to Sirhan. So I'm going to read a couple paragraphs here real quick. Sirhan, the man who has been characterized as both the first Palestinian terrorist as well as the quintessential Manchurian candidate, was described after his alleged assassination of Robert F. Kennedy in 1968 as having been, quote, motivated by Kennedy's support for Israel, end quote. Sirhan is supposed to have written in a book, quote, Kennedy must die by June 5th, i.e. the anniversary of the outbreak of the Six-Day War in 1967. Sirhan retracted his initial admission of guilt in the crime, claiming to have been hypno-programmed by the assassination's plotters. Indeed, more than one researcher suggested that Los Angeles sex therapist and hypnosis expert William J. Bryan did the programming. Bryan, a self-proclaimed eccentric character, once boasted to two of his favorite prostitutes that he, in fact, had hypnotized Sirhan and had worked on top-secret CIA projects, writes forgotten terrorist author Mel Aiton. Bryan's most famous hypnotic subject was the notorious Boston strangler Albert DeSalvo, whose name appeared in Sirhan's notebooks. Bryan, this is the same William Bryan, the hypnosis expert, it has been suggested that Sirhan may have been hypno-programmed by. Bryan served as a technical advisor on John Frankenheimer's film The Manchurian Candidate, made in 1962, which is about a brainwashed assassin. Frankenheimer had been a successful television director in 1960 when he declined an offer to work for the John F. Kennedy presidential campaign. According to Frankenheimer, United Artists executive Arthur Krim, that's the aforementioned Arthur Krim, had aspirations to become the U.S. ambassador to Israel and was reluctant to greenlight the Manchurian Candidate for fear it would upset Kennedy. Krim is supposed to have relented, however, after learning that JFK was a fan of the novel written by, I believe, Robert Condon. Frankenheimer said he felt guilty after the Kennedy assassination for not having done the work for his campaign, proceeded to insinuate himself with the Robert F. Kennedy camp. When JFK's brother declared his candidacy in 1968, I immediately called Pierre Salinger and said, Pierre, I want to be part of this. I never left him, Frankenheimer recalled. I was there with him for 102 days. Then talks about how he and Bobby became best friends, and Frankenheimer says he was staying with them in Malibu, and he drove him to the Ambassador Hotel where he was shot. So it's all just really strange that and then there's even more interesting information that gets into Sirhan and other stuff related to that. But people can read more about this article, can check out this article if they want to look more into this. But it's just very interesting that, not knowing any of the dynamics of the deeper Kennedy-Frankenheimer relationship, that, RFK stays the night before his assassination, is driven to the Ambassador Hotel by this director who had directed this movie, The Manchurian Candidate, and drives Kennedy to the site of the event where he's going to be assassinated by a real life, it appears, by all indicators, and candidate. And the place that he and Kennedy were staying at just happens to be, now in the hands of Arnon Milchan. Just fascinating and, in some ways disturbing reality here. This is wild stuff.
Yes, and then so I want to return to the question of who owned the buildings and this network that organized this, because this is interesting. So here's this satellite building out in Malibu where the connection is very, very strange, and then the connection then to the to United Artists and the Crims puts this network right in the heart of Zionist power at the highest levels and operating at the highest levels within the United States of America. Because when you're dealing with Krim, you're then dealing not only with Arthur Krim, who's a very influential guy from Hollywood, but a big political player, but you're also then dealing with his wife, Matilda Krim, who is seen very much as an Irgun operative who had an affair with Johnson and is said to have been with Johnson, I believe, I don't know if it was the night before the USS Liberty attack or when the war had started, but it's interesting in Jeff Gates' book Guilt by Association. There is some very interesting stuff about the Crims that I might just read a little bit from now before we return to the scene of the crime specifically, because here's the scene of another crime.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, page 52, Deep Insiders. Matilda Krim. Quote, Matilda Krim, a striking blonde Italian 20 years younger than her husband, was previously married to David Denon. Raised in Palestine, her handsome Jewish Bulgarian husband was exiled by the British for his activities with Irgun Zvi Leumi, the Zionist terror network led by Menachem Begin, who emerged as Likud party prime minister in 1977. Matilda also worked as an Irgun operative largely in Europe. The Crims became regular guests at the LBJ Ranch. As Halsell explained, quote, there were also many instances in which Arthur and Matilda were guests at the White House, and other times when, for many days running, Matilda, without her husband, was a guest there. The Crims built a vacation home near the LBJ Ranch known as Matilda's House, and Johnson often traveled there by helicopter, unquote. As with Morgenthau's proximity to Roosevelt, the Crims' proximity to Johnson ensured that their friendship flourished when the Senate Majority Leader became John F. Kennedy's surprise pick as vice president, and then succeeded him to the presidency following Kennedy's assassination in November 1963. Over the 1967 Memorial Day weekend, the Crims were house guests at the LBJ Ranch when the commander-in-chief learned of Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygин's warning that, quote, if Israel starts military actions, the Soviet Union will extend help to the attacked party, unquote. While waiting for the State Department to draft a response to Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, Johnson and the Crims drove to a neighbor's home where an aide brought the message for the president's review. Halsell described the changes that LBJ made to the message in italics below while in the Crims company to explain America's perspective on the pending conflict. This is a quote from that. After reassuring Eshkol of America's interests in Israel's security, the draft message continued, quote, it is essential that Israel not take any preemptive military action and thereby make itself responsible for the initiation of hostilities, unquote. LBJ restated the warning by adding 2 key words so that the sentence conveyed a message far more amenable to Tel Aviv. Quote, "It is essential that Israel just must not take any preemptive military action," unquote. According to Kennedy, under Secretary of State George Ball, Johnson made it clear both to the Israelis and his Jewish American supporters that the U.S. would not object if the Israelis took matters into their own hands. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara offers a different account, recalling that Johnson and he, quote, "put immense pressure on Israeli Foreign Minister Abba Eban to persuade his government not to preempt," unquote. I'm going to continue just a little bit longer here. Johnson's Kosygin-prompted note to Levi Eshkol, written in the presence of Arthur and Matilda Krim, suggests that both men are correct. Tel Aviv could preempt provided the American public could be induced to believe that Israel was the victim and not the aggressor, a strategy fully consistent with game theory. Johnson then traveled to New York for a $1,000 a plate fundraiser on June 3rd, sponsored by Arthur Krim, who chaired the President's Club of New York. Matilda was seated next to Johnson when Abe Feinberg, the American Zionist community's legendary political fundraiser, leaned over Matilda's shoulder and whispered, quote, "Mr. President, it," referring to Tel Aviv's attack, "can't be held any longer. It's going within the next 24 hours, unquote.
Abraham Feinberg, I believe, who the famous whistle stop tour with the True Saved Us 48 campaign on behalf of the state of Israel, and I believe even the mysterious suitcase full of money.
Yes, I believe so. I believe that's that exact network, and also of being part of nuclear smuggling ring. Abraham Feinberg was at the center of that. And now I've heard people reference that that this is related to Steve Feinberg, but I haven't seen the evidence for that. I'd be interested if someone can track that down to see whether this is the same Feinberg family as Stephen Feinberg of the Intelligence Advisory Board, Cerberus Capital, DynCorp, all of that. And then in the rest, the next page is really nailed down what the next portion of this is titled "The Pre-Staging the Six-Day War," and talks about the run-up to the USS Liberty attack, and Matilda Krim, being the former Irgun operative, was Johnson's guest at the White House that night on June 5th. So, and then think about this as just 1 year, actually, to the day before Robert Kennedy is then assassinated allegedly by a Palestinian, right? A Palestinian-American, Sirhan, who's angry with him about Israel-Palestine, allegedly. So the level of the flipping and the deception surrounding this is pretty incredible. And so then finally, I just wanted to then deal with this question of the ownership of the buildings and what this all meant. And we'll link some articles that are related to all of that, fan.blogspot, which puts up very interesting write-ups that have lots of links, and definitely a Christopher Bolin article that we've mentioned before titled "JFK and 9/11, Henry Crown and the Cover-Ups of Our Time," showing that Henry Crown of General Dynamics was very close to the Warren Commission. In fact, I'll just quote from this very briefly. Quote, "Henry Crown of Chicago controlled the nearly bankrupt General Dynamics of Fort Worth, Texas at the time of the JFK assassination. Henry Crown's personal lawyer, Albert E. Jenner Jr., served on the Warren Commission, where he was tasked with investigating the evidence of a conspiracy behind Lee Harvey Oswald or Jack Ruby," unquote. Right, and who's Jack Ruby? That's Jacob Rubenstein. He's tied directly into the Mickey Cohen, Meyer-Lansky network, Mickey Cohen being basically the West Coast, Los Angeles boss of that network. And then if you go back into RFK and the assassination at the Ambassador Hotel, back to this Anir fan article, I'm going to just read from this. The Ambassador Hotel was owned by J. Meyer Schein, the father of G. David Schein, who, quote, slept with Roy Cohn, the mentor of Donald Trump. and parenthetically, this is Whitney Webb has dealt with these aspects of the Epstein network background in relationship to Cohen in her articles, and she has recently released an article, her fourth and final article about the Epstein network that really ties it deeply into the Clintons, and then even further concretizes the relationship of the Epstein network to what was known as the Iran-Contra network, and all of that, with also a very deep inclusion of people like Lady Rothschild, Forrester de Rothschild, and her closeness with Clinton, and what she was interested in when she had time with Clinton, including Epstein. Okay, back to this article. So the Ambassador Hotel was owned by J. Meyer Schein, the father of G. David Schein, who slept with Roy Cohn, the mentor of Donald Trump. J. Meyer Schein was connected to the Jewish mob, J. Edgar Hoover, and the Henry Crown family. Then there's a picture of Lester Crown and a younger Benjamin Netanyahu. Lester Crown, son of Henry Crown, born Krinsky, was the largest shareholder of General Dynamics, a leading defense contractor. Henry Crown was a high-level Zionist agent who sent an aircraft manufacturing plant to Israel in the early 1950s in violation of U.S. law. The factory he sent to Israel illegally became the original Israel Aircraft Industries, IAI, plant. The Crown family is also connected to both Kennedy assassinations and the 9/11 cover-up. And then they link to JFK, 9/11, Henry Crown, and the cover-ups of our time by Bolin. Under Meyer Schein's ownership, the Ambassador Hotel hosted the gambling operations of Mickey Cohen, the West Coast lieutenant of Jewish mob boss Meyer Lansky. U.S. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy had been involved in the prosecution of Cohen, in which he was convicted for tax evasion and sent to Alcatraz in 1961. Who arranged for Kennedy to use the Ambassador Hotel? And then it links to an article titled "The Peculiar Similarities Between 9/11 and the Assassination of RFK." Okay, so I just wanted to bring that in to show what this network actually is, who owns the buildings, and that becomes very important data, I think, for understanding what is actually at work here.
Yes, thank you for that. And so we'll just tying further dots together, I think, with or established research. I want to, just reiterate that, we're not taking shape or form for.
You're cutting in and out, Greg, a little bit.
I apologize.
We're missing a lot of your words.
Okay, I'm sorry here. Okay, is this bad?
No,
okay.
It's still cutting out. I think it's maybe an internet connection, but we'll just keep going, and
It might be. I apologize for that.
That's okay. So I just want, before we leave the RFK topic and the relevancy of Sirhan just recently being stabbed and the alleged threat by a fellow Israeli prisoner, I just wanted to put on the table, there's this very strange connection to a woman named Anna Chenot, who there's this infamous story of the woman in the polka dot dress on the night of Robert Kennedy's assassination, who's said to have been running out saying, we got him, or something. We shot him. And she apparently had a lot of interaction and interface with Sirhan over the course of the evening. And it turns out that she claimed, this woman in the polka dot dress claimed that she had immediately previous relationship, or had been brought into the country apparently by Anna Chenot, who had been the Chinese wife of Claire Chenot, who had helped start the Civil Air Transport, which is ultimately became Air America, Southern Air Transport, all of these CIA drug running, arms running companies that ultimately it looks like get taken up by Wexner and Epstein in relationship to the reporting by Bob Petrakis in relationship to Spook Air, Southern Air Transport, the moving of it to Rickenbacker Air Base in Columbus, Ohio, and that whole part of the network. So I think it's very interesting. I don't have all the details on that background, but maybe we'll dig back into that later on, this Anna Chenot connection. And she's a very interesting figure. She's operating at the highest levels. She is apparently involved even in relationship to the I believe the Nixon administration or the incoming Nixon campaign, trying to sabotage some of the Vietnam War peace talks. So that is a very interesting piece of all of this.
Kind of a now.
Wait, say again.
Already able.
You come in and then it cuts out.
Okay, my apologies for that. Yeah, the Chenault thing is kind of almost the continuum of what happened. Maybe this alleged interference to Vietnam peace talks, and then you think about what happened approximately a little over a decade later, with Carter and the sabotaging of attempts to have hostages freed, and how that played into the Kennedy. But anyway, all this history here with Chenault being a part of the nationalist China lobby, that'll be something to look into in the future, and how that might relate even into like your history with regards to China and some of the things we talked about last week with the strange, interesting dynamics going on with various elements of Chinese policy and what seems to be going on under the Trump administration. But I'll say one more thing before we break off the RFK topic is our friend Chris Rulon on Twitter put out a great endorsement for Lisa Pease's book on the Kennedy assassination, A Lie Too Big to Fail, The Real History of the Assassination of John F. Kennedy, which deals with the Los Angeles Police Department silencing witnesses with evidence of conspiracy and altering and destruction of evidence, and then a media role as well as the role of the the justice system in its failures and what may have led up to this, and where lays out a case for where the dots seem to go in terms of the people with the most means and motives to assassinate Robert Kennedy, and why he had to be taken out before he became the president. So, and that's something that sounds like a book that would be up our alley to perhaps get our hands on here in the near future. So I just wanted to mention that book by Lisa Pease, A Lie Too Big to Fail, The Real History of the Assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, just published December of last year. So.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Yeah, let's look into that book. And in moving sort of out of the RFK discussion, I want to bring up one last thing about Milchan from the book about him, from Confidential, that relates to this idea of these high-level industrial networks that are part and parcel of what's going on in terms of these espionage operations, and these deep political events, these deep state hits are always surrounded by people who have deep investment in certain kinds of industrial transfer, industrial escalation in relationship to nuclear programs, or certain kinds of war-making machinery, or energy resources. Think in the current day of Genie Energy, and how that's seemingly tied into the Trump and the Epstein network, and things like Carbine 911, and all the people such as Peter Thiel and Epstein and Ehud Barak and Nicole Junkerman, who we'll get to in a interesting new Johnny Vedmore story about Junkerman and Epstein in the UK. But then also people like Michael Chertoff, in very much related to that. So I just want to point out that these high-level industrial interests and contacts are also very much present. So from page 31 of Confidential, The Life of Secret Agent turned Hollywood Tycoon Arnon Milchan, quote, "It all happened Quote, however, it was one invention, one patent, one purchase, and one gamble that secured the company finances and propelled him to the next level. They're talking about Milchan's company, the Milchan brothers, I think it's titled. It involved an Israeli product that to this day is considered one of the most enterprising inventions from a tiny country that over time has become a world powerhouse of innovation. It all happened by chance, as Arnon's desperate maneuvers to save the company began to show results after signing the Swiss companies Sandoz, right? Who's Sandoz? Isn't that the pharmaceutical or the chemical company that was the producer of the original LSD? I believe so, yes. Sandoz and Ciba-Geigy. Sandoz and Ciba-Geigy merged in the 90s to create Novartis. Okay, everybody knows what Novartis. He set an appointment for a meeting at the world's second largest chemical manufacturer, DuPont, in Wilmington, Delaware. And parenthetically, who was an executive at DuPont, Robert Mueller II. It was a executive at DuPont. Back to this. On the long flight over, he contemplated the ineffectiveness of the current fertilizer distributed by Milchan brothers. Coincidentally, the stranger sitting next to him on the flight was a logging company executive from Canada. During their casual conversation, Milchan was fascinated to learn that tree bark was not used for any product and was simply disposed of after wood was processed. Okay, I'm going to fast forward here. Upon arrival, he shared his thoughts with DuPont executives who were at a loss about what to do with the enthusiastic young businessman from Israel and his strange ideas about bark. He was referred to the only Jewish executive in the company at the time, a man by the name of Irving Saul Shapiro, DuPont's lawyer. Shapiro was impressed by Milchan and invited him to spend the weekend at his house. He also invited a group from the local Jewish community to meet the young man from Israel and hear his stories from the embattled country. By Monday, Milchan had secured a close friendship with Shapiro, a contract for exclusive representation of DuPont in Israel, and a commitment to finance experiments with bark in Israel. A key Milchan contact, Shapiro would later become the chairman and CEO of DuPont from 1973 to 1981. It was the beginning of a long and close relationship with the company, which had been an integral part of the Manhattan Project, the research group that developed the nuclear bomb during World War II, and has long been a supplier of nuclear and defense-related material. Okay, I'm going to unquote. I'm going to stop that there, but I just want to point out that these key relationships and networks, I think, are central to understanding this network. And the CEO, the sort of first Jewish CEO of DuPont, having this deep background with Milchan, who is working on behalf of the Bureau of Scientific Relations, LACOM, basically technological espionage, right? He'd been involved in nuclear espionage. But you got to imagine too, this is the era, this is the run up to the beginning of the Tapiot program and the launching of things like the Promise enhanced software in worldwide and into the heart of the U.S. Nuclear apparatus, but also the Pollard network and the transfer of all of those secrets. Some of those are security secrets, but on surrounding all of this is questions of technology, industry, and all of that. So let's move on, Greg.
Okay. Are we going to get into? Would you like to this interesting Epstein? Nicole Junkerman information as it relates back to Leslie Wexner?
Yes. And as we're on our way there, I just want to also then point out this relationship of the Technion. We mentioned it before, the Technion University, over 100 years old, at the heart of the burgeoning, the plans for the Zionist state in Israel, and then after a key nodal point of the creation of industrial technology and for the Israeli state, that there is also then this question of the support networks, and we identified that the American Technion Society is located right around the corner from Trump Tower in New York. And then I just wanted to say that I'd found an interesting scenario in this Technion book by Karl Alpert, The Story of Israel's Institute of Technology, that on page 219, when they talk about the early before Israel, actually, I think this is looking for the representatives of Technion looking for funding and support from American members of the network. It includes a listing of Samuel Zemurray, the president of the United Fruit Company, who we've spoken about as a key figure, sort of in the background, as almost like the godfather of the core members of the mega group. So yeah, let's move into this article by Johnny Vedmore.
Yes, the swamp.media, and we've previously cited Johnny Vedmore in relation to an article he wrote, really detailing the relationship between Jeffrey Epstein and Nicole Junkerman and their relationship. However, he's now zeroed in on a very particular. I think he's really gotten details on a meeting between Junkerman, a 2002 meeting that he had referenced in his previous article on this relation meeting taking place on September 1st, 2002. Jeffrey Epstein, Nicole Junkerman, and appears American senators, members of the United States Senate, in a house in I guess on the outskirts of Birmingham, England, that is owned by the Wexner family.
Yes, and this
house is called the Foxcoat House, purchased by Leslie and Abigail Wexner in 1997.
Yes, and Johnny Vedmore had done research and identified that Nicole Junkerman was one who then ends up being this key figure in relationship to sports media in Europe and questions of the FIFA scandal. And then most recently and centrally in relationship to this Epstein technology question is Carbine 9/11 being part of that, listed on the as a part of the leadership at that company. That she was Nicole Junkerman was one of the few listings of where Epstein was on a plane with someone alone, other than, without his usual squad. And so that sort of launched his investigation into that. And then he realized that Nicole Junkerman was also deeply involved in what looks like Israeli intelligence involvement in the UK health administration and data and all of that. And what he's done is gone back in and dug into what was actually going on in relationship to this trip. So this is really a deep dive journalism. This is real investigative journalism, working with open source, and then also working, scanning documents from the time to see who might have been there, and then also working with sources to nail this down. And I think this is key to understanding some of the background of this network. I would say especially in relationship to further bolstering the evidence that this was the key to the network that was pushing the war on Iraq. And this was the questions that I was asking the presidential candidates in Iowa on the day that it had been reported that Epstein had been found dead. And it would have been easy to have been caught up in the question of, did he die? How did he die? All of that. But it was very clear that the more important question here was, what is the network that is still obviously left in place no matter what did or did not happen to Epstein? This question of Wexner, the Wexner War, the propaganda network for the Iraq War, obviously part and parcel of even things going way back to Iran-Contra, and more and more the question of September 11th. Is this that network, too? So I think it's interesting to nail this down, so Epstein and Junkerman are in the UK together at a Wexner owned big old estate that is really fairly they fly into Birmingham, and then they take a private a helicopter down south 25 miles, something to this estate, and are staying there with the U.S. senators. But I also then want to point out that this is fairly close to Cheltenham, which is the town in the UK where the British NSA, the GCHQ, is located. And so if you think about the timing of this, the coming fall of 2002, this is right before the U.S. Congress begins to vote on the policy that begins to ramp up towards the Iraq War, but then also in relationship to the Catherine Gunn, and when we reported on the film that we'd seen of State of Official Secrets, I think it's called, the name of the film about her whistleblowing.
Yes, Official Secrets, yes.
And so she was obviously working at GCHQ at this very exact time, and so the kind of things that she blew the whistle on were obviously already in the works in relationship to the UK. The email that she then did the whistleblowing on came in, I believe, in January of 2003. But you got to know that this kind of operation, and especially since what we know about things like blackmail in relationship to Epstein, but the blackmail for something specifically, that was very likely in the background of the UK and not just the US. Because why would you need to meet U.S. senators in the UK in order to have conversations with them, potentially use leverage or create leverage, if this didn't have something also to do with the UK. So I'm just pointing out another geography thing here, that this Foxcote House owned by the Wexners at the time, that Junkerman and Epstein were being guarded apparently by apparently like state police, UK state police, with U.S. senators present is fairly close to the GCHQ. And I don't know if there's any connection there in relationship to the kind of operations that were going on there, but I imagine there might be. So I just want to lay out a few more things about this story. We'll link to it so people can go and read it. But he does nail down a lot of the background of this area, who the elite of the elite, and Elizabeth Murdoch, and actors like Ben Kingsley and Patrick Stewart. The establishment elite have manners out in this area of the country. And the question then about which senators were there, I think, is a very interesting one. And Johnny Vedmore does background research in terms of who were the Wexners actually financing at that time, in terms of their personal donations. And there's actually a small grouping of it. And definitely someone like John Kerry is right in the middle there. But also the senator, the junior senator from New Mexico.
Bingaman.
Jeff Bingaman is a part of that small list. But then also there's the infamous Chuck Schumer, who is being looked at in relationship to this. So we'll link to this article, and people can then sort of see what was going on. There's also a Ted Kennedy potentiality there. I do think this question of Jeff Bingaman being the New Mexico connection here, and especially what we know about the Zorro Ranch, what we talked about the background there, and Bill Richardson, the former governor of New Mexico, the former head of the Department of Energy, where the nukes are overseen from, the New Mexico being the site of the epicenter of the U.S. nuclear security apparatus in many ways, with Los Alamos and Sandia Labs and more. I think it should be looked at very, very, very intently. And then go for it.
Real quick, before, and I wanted to mention, you just brought up this meeting at this Wexner-owned house in the UK, and Epstein and this whole operation, and then you brought up GCHQ and this film, Official Secrets, about Catherine Gunn, and one of the in the film a meeting of Lord Goldsmith, who was the equivalent basically of the UK of the Attorney General of the UK, and he had to give his legal authority as to whether or not in Iraq would be within the legal boundaries of the UK government, of the Tony Blair government, to launch. And he was initially against it before going to a meeting in Washington D.C. where it was described as Office of Special Plans people, even Israeli generals, and of course much to Phyllis Bennis's dismay at the screening that we went to. You mentioned particularly Abram Shulsky, the director of the film, Gavin Wolf, and told people to look into Office of Special Plans and Abram Shulsky. So I'm wondering, is there a continuation between this, the Senate, all of this with GC, with this Birmingham, with this meeting at the Wexner House on the outskirts of Birmingham, the Senate involvement of American senators, and then obviously British intelligence, and then to the U.S. and meeting with, among other people, Israeli generals in this meeting that caused his opinion basically to shift on whether or not the Iraq War would be legal for the to be carried out by the British government, by Great Britain. So I just wanted to bring that up, and then we're going to talk about in a second the Wexner analysis on the Iraq War, which I think we're going to bring up in a minute in the role of one of Arthur Finkelstein's quote unquote kids, Frank Luntz, in drafting that. So.
Okay, good. And actually, just to clarify, I believe that it was the director himself who first brought up Abram Shulsky all on his own during the question and answer period.
Yes.
And then
during the film, it was mentioned that Office of Special Plans, and I believe the Israeli generals were mentioned in the film briefly as being among the people who Goldsmith.
I don't believe the Israeli generals were mentioned,
okay,
and actually, that's what I had brought up. Was I had brought up the of what's her name, the Karen Kwiatkowski, saying that there was these Israeli generals that were being brought past Pentagon security processes in the days after September 11th, and in relationship to the run up to the Iraq War, I think. So that I do think that this is a key. There's a lot more to unpack here in relationship to this coordination of this plan. And so let me just read a little bit from the Johnny Vedmore article that references the Wexner analysis, and then we can delve into that for our last minutes here. Okay, the Wexner War on Iraq. Quote, while Epstein and Junkerman were entertaining United States senators at Les Wexner's British hunting ground, Washington, D.C. was abuzz with activity. The start of the new political season was just beginning, and there was much to do. On September 3rd, 2002, the freshly vacationed senators would vote on the confirmation of Terrence F. McVeary of Pennsylvania to be a United States District Judge. The Amber Alert Bill was introduced and passed. It was also the beginning of preparations towards the Iraq War before it had been even voted on by the Senate. Max Baucus, parenthetically, I think he is then also identified as having received Wexner money, but people can double check that. Max Baucus, who was then chairman of the Committee on Finance, put out a press release on 3rd September entitled Baucus Schedules a Markup of a Substitute for H.R. 5063, Armed Forces Tax Fairness Act of 2002, unquote. This was the first bill to prepare for the Iraq War. It gave tax incentives to U.S. troops so as to make war pay. Only one sitting Republican Party member would vote against the war. He would be joined by one independent and only 21 Democrats. An aside, one of the Democrats, I think, who voted against it was Jeff Bingham. What's his name again? The senator from New Mexico, Greg?
Jeff Bingaman, yes.
Bingaman. And so he actually did vote at Bingaman, even though he was part of this, paid by this Wexner network, was given money by this Wexner network, voted against it. However, I would just point out that as we'll continue to read here, there's an understanding about the value, especially during this time period, of looking like either silent or being not for this war in relationship to apparent Israeli propaganda. So let's just read this section. Quote, Les Wexner would be a major force in pushing for the war with Iraq. A document leaked in 2003 entitled, quote, Luntz Wexner analysis, Israeli communications priorities 2003, unquote, commissioned and produced by the Wexner Foundation, should be studied in universities globally as a perfect example of elite state propaganda. On its opening page, it states, quote, the fact that Israel has remained relatively silent for the 3 months preceding the war and for the 3 weeks of the war was absolutely the correct strategy, and according to all the polling done, it worked, unquote. An aside here, let's just point out who Frank Luntz is, who's the guy, who's the media operator heading this Wexner analysis, this Wexner war analysis. That's Frank Luntz, well known as a Republican sort of framer, a communications expert, also a so-called pollster. But what is he also? He's also one of the Arthur Finkelstein kids networks, the Finky's kids networks that we did an extended show about. So I think people might want to go back to that. Again, look back in the background of Arthur Finkelstein at the epicenter of the launching of the Trump campaign and the mainlining and the mainstreaming of it into the heart of the Republican establishment, but also Arthur Finkelstein as the key operative in launching Netanyahu into the prime minister's office in Israel, and then also his relationship with Viktor Orban and even people like Jesse Helms on the domestic front. So I think that's a key to understand who's actually doing this analysis.
Yes, and so many of these Finkelstein kids, when you see these people put out on TV as you know, pollsters or political analysts, whatever, obviously when you see these political pundits or pollsters or whatever put on television, a lot of the time it turns out that they're within this Arthur Finkelstein network. And so all of this, I think, is very interesting, with the primary member of the Finky's Kids network pushing some of these analysis that lead to a big part of the propaganda push for the Iraq War. Of course, Frank Luntz, and then look further on into the what you've talked about here, Finkelstein's role in the rise of like the right wing, people like Jesse Helms, Senator Jesse Helms, and then this Netanyahu election, even further on, more recently with Hungary and Viktor Orban, as well as the Finkelstein network being at the heart of a lot of the right wing, I think, exaggerated narrative of George Soros as this all empowered boogeyman who's responsible for every ill on the face of the planet, and then even the John McLaughlin, who you confronted, who worked for Netanyahu, and then also went on to be involved with the Trump campaign in various ways. So very interesting history. One more thing I'll mention is that you mentioned the politicians who were told basically, some people have to take not to be public with their, Iraq war, kind of maybe put out a public veneer of opposition. Another person who received Epstein money was John Kerry. And of course, Senator John Kerry would rise up as the main opposition, quote unquote opposition, 2004 election. So.
Yeah, and then that makes you wonder exactly like the role of John Kerry in sort of being allowing the 2004 election to be stolen from him, as he even almost basically directly told Mark Crispin Miller when Mark Crispin Miller contacted him, or in person they spoke about Mark Crispin Miller's book about the evidence of the 2004 election fraud, and Kerry basically let Mark Crispin Miller know that he knew, but that he was not really going to do anything about it. And now we have some background about why Kerry might not have wanted to do anything about it. So in our last 30 seconds here, we will also link to the original Wexner War article by Bob Fitrakis, but I'm just going to finish this last paragraph here. Fitrakis finishes his enthralling article by stating, quote, lobbying groups like the Mega Group and government insiders like Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl are engaged in a systematic campaign to identify Israeli national security interests with U.S. military and security interests. The Wexner analysis merely documents this extensive, often covert campaign that deserves public debate and democratic discourse, not secret PR campaigns. Maybe Epstein, unquote, maybe Epstein was simply lobbying the senators for his pal and probable fellow Mossad agent Leslie Wexner, unquote. So I guess until next week, we'll leave it there. Thank you, Greg.